Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first day of the conference, The Public Cost of Personal Hardship, Evaluating the Hidden Expense of Cost-Cutting Measures on Social Well-Being. My name is Niamh Mulcahy, and I am, in addition to the organizer of this conference, who has been emailing you probably over several weeks if you've been speaking at it, and indeed months. I'm also the Alice Tong Shi Research Fellow at CRASSH and Lucy Cavendish College within the University of Cambridge. And I specialize in economic sociology and the study of class-based inequality, particularly in an era of finance. So the conference, as you will have seen, is quite focused on the way that political, social, and even personal costs are externalized and often disregarded when measures are taken to enact forms of fiscal discipline, such as especially the austerity measures that have been implemented around the world in the wake of the fallout of the 2008 global financial crisis. The policy narrative driving these kinds of cuts is pretty well known by now. Public services are expensive and they require higher taxes and government borrowing. But maybe even more to the point, in almost a sinister fashion, people who rely on public services instead of striving for independence from government provision are what's expensive. We risk, in this view, plunging future generations into debt to pay for excessive spending in the present. And the only solution then is probably to trim both our personal spending as well as public spending in order to allow the economy to regenerate through entrepreneurial and industrial innovation that will restore jobs and prosperity. Of course, in reality, people incur costs when they try to reduce spending to a minimum. And they usually occur in the form of something like costly debt that helps make up shortfall if there's insufficient incomings to cover daily costs. Living on a shoestring budget also impacts mental and physical health, creates problems related to unmet needs, and can put pressure on local economies if spending within the community goes down as a result of everybody trying to save for themselves. Governments at national, regional, and local levels do not stop spending altogether in the wake of austerity measures either. They may begin to increase costs around punishment, going after those who are in arrears on taxes and bills, and an increasingly pervasive problem in the UK, something known as benefits overpayment, which is when people are initially maybe paid out more than they should be and then have to repay the excess to government. Or they may face pressures related to overspending when immediate social support is needed for many households in need within the community, prompting unexpected costs in excess of budgetary expectations. The papers in the sessions and keynotes of this conference each conceptualize or problematize the notion of cost in unique ways and through a variety of lenses. So some focus on economic concerns related to the changing nature of public spending, whilst others examine the difficulty in measuring the cost of failing to provide for underserved populations. There are also those that deal with the inverse of austerity by examining the benefits of spending on certain social problems as a way of demonstrating the social or personal costs that could be incurred as a result of doing nothing. And in other veins, the morality associated with cost and repayment is considered, especially in relation to well-being and the stress felt by debtors. I think it brings an exciting dimension thinking through the notion of externalized costs through each of our sessions and keynote talks. Now, it feels very conspicuous to me that this conference should have originated in the university town of Cambridge, which has often been named one of the UK's most unequal cities. With exorbitant housing prices related in no small part to the footprint of the university and its constituent colleges in the real estate market, many people who work in Cambridge cannot afford to actually live in the city, or at least near where they work, driving up commute costs. A report published by the university in March of this year extols a £30 billion economic impact made by the university across the UK and beyond, related to everything from research activities, patents and spin-outs, educational exports such as English as a second language teaching material, undergraduate teaching and learning, and tourism to the city of Cambridge associated with the university. And yet, the question of the benefits on the local and regional area is unresolved. It has certainly been noted that while Cambridge maintains an impressive set of global research networks, its interaction with some of the most underserved geographical areas in its own backyard, so to speak, is limited. I'm glad, as a result, that our discussions over the course of this conference, which feature papers covering a breadth of response to austerity measures in North America, Western Europe, and across the UK, also reach into the locality of Cambridge itself. We will hear from a couple of speakers linked with local government and the charitable sector, including the one I'm about to introduce, about growing unmet need taking place in wards a little further afield than the famous Gothic or neo-Gothic city centre, which often attracts such attention. I have just a few acknowledgements and ground rules to declare before the first talk. I'd like to thank, obviously, everybody who has helped in the preparation and now the actual laying out of this conference, because of course, when you plan something like this yourself, you inevitably need to ask for help from multiple people. And so I'd like to thank a couple of people, including Ariane Hannemeyer, who has done, I think, a lot of work both to support the conference, first and foremost, through co-authoring a paper with me, but she's also chairing a panel, and I think she's generally helped to drum up support among potential speakers. And I'd like to thank, in a similar vein, Matthew Sparks for stepping in at short notice to take over a panel that needed a moderator. I'm, of course, grateful to each of the 4 keynote speakers for agreeing to present amid otherwise very busy schedules that they have. And of course, this conference is supported and facilitated by CRASSH at Cambridge. I'm really appreciative of Nicky Davidowski, our conference coordinator, who has been quietly putting in a lot of work on the technical side on my behalf and will do so over the next 2 days. The ground rules are pretty standard for this kind of conference in that CRASSH, first and foremost, requests the use of language that is respectful, both of participants and speakers, as well as of the material being discussed, so avoidance of classist, sexist, or racist formulations. The format is pretty standard as well, in that questions may be asked by raising your hand or using the hand icon, but they can also be posed in the chat to be read out by the participant or the moderator if preferred. And in this respect, if you would prefer not to be recorded, then please feel free, obviously, to use the chat function. But we also really encourage input from graduate students and early career researchers who I think often feel overlooked in larger conference settings. So if you wish to identify yourself as such when you're asking your question, we will ensure that it gets addressed. I'm now really happy to introduce our first speaker, who's going to give sort of a first-hand account of the effects of austerity in Cambridge. So Nicky Shepard is the CEO of Abbey People, a charity providing social support such as food hubs, assistance with access to education and employment, and the cultivation of a sense of community through environmental and volunteering projects in Abbey Ward, Cambridge. Having worked in both the public and private sector, Nicky was appointed in September 2020 to help coordinate the growing and vibrant charity. And her talk today is titled Stories from the Frontline of Austerity in Abbey Ward, Cambridge. So thanks very much, Nicky, and welcome.
There we go. Thank you. It's really, really lovely to be here. Thank you very much for that introduction. And it's really exciting to be able to just bring a bit of the people element to these stories. And obviously, I know that there's going to be lots of papers looking at lots of different elements of people and how that turns into research over globally. And as Niamh said, Cambridge is a place that people often think is a very affluent area. It is an affluent area. It has one of the highest amounts of tech unicorns as anywhere I'm just checking, you can see the correct slides, can we? Yes, so Cambridge is a really lovely place to live. I've lived here in Cambridge for 24 years myself. And it is an area that generates a huge amount of economic activity into the global economy, as well as into the UK economy. We have one of the highest levels of tech unicorns of anywhere in the world. A huge number of university spinouts are a big part of that. and it's generally economically a pretty great place. But there's another side to that. So Cambridge, there was a Centre for Cities report in a few years ago, which named Cambridge as the most unequal city in the UK. And this slide, this is taken from the UK government's multi-deprivation indices, and it compares 2019 with 2015, which are the kind of most recent sets of these indices. And the dark blue you will see, and ringed on there, is part of Barnwell, which is in Abbey Ward, which is where we work. And you can see there, the darker blue is the least affluent areas, and the greens and whites are areas that are more affluent and have less deprivation. And so this is a way of showing just how the impact of that. And the dark blue that you can see on this map, the darkest blue is places which are in the top 20% most deprived in the country, in the UK. And then one thing that you can't see from this photograph that I've showed you here today is that from 2015 to 2019, Abbey is the only ward in Cambridge that became more deprived. And this was, I think, really is, the title of my talk is about austerity, and what we're talking about is the impact of austerity right there. So over those times, what happened because of austerity and because of the cuts to various levels of funding, people became more deprived, and that affects people as individuals. So if we delve into those a little bit and what some of those are. So looking at multi-deprivation indices, as you will know, it goes across the whole range of what causes people harm. And an example is in the Children's Centre. So in sort of between 2007 and 2010, when I was spending a lot of time at the local Children's Centre with my children, we had a vibrant children's centre. It was a Sure Starts Hit children's centre here in the ward. It had activities every day of the week. There was family workers there were midwives there was support. So any parent in the ward who was having difficulty could go to the children's centre and get support on any day of the week and know that that was there. So there was a safety net. It was a government subsidised safety net, and there were people from all aspects of government who were based in that children's centre. Over that period from 2010 to 2019, all of that has changed. So even to the point that in 2017, we were actually having a county-wide campaign to stop the cuts to the children's centres that happened at the county council. The children's centre was actually at threat of complete closure, and we were able to keep the building open, but it doesn't even begin to resemble what was there in, just before 2010. And so that's one example of one service that was cut because of reductions in government funding because of austerity. But what you don't see with that from that reduced funding is the impact on people's lives. So in Abbey, we've seen this increased need over the period. And from 2019, when the last multi-deprivation indices, obviously we've had a global pandemic and a cost of living crisis. And we know county council data that from January 2020 to November 2020, there was a 300% increase in benefit claimants in Abbey. What we saw on the ground was that a lot of those were people who had never claimed benefits before. They didn't know how to navigate the benefit system. They didn't understand what things like sanctions were. They didn't know how to access more support, and they didn't know where there was a support network. But what we found, part of the reason why Abbey People exists, and especially in the form we do now, is because the increasing need, the reduced funding and the lack of community facilities in our ward, and really because of austerity and the cuts to government provision, meant that there was no safety net. Any safety net that was there for the people of this ward was gone. And it came down to us as a community charity to fill some of those gaps. So what we now do is we have 4 key areas that we work in. So one of them is vibrant community, which is what we were initially set up to do in 2010. And that's things like fun community events, fetes, gardening, those sorts of fun things that people do in the area where they live. Our helping each other thread of our work is now the largest thread of our work. And that involves drop-in support, helping people with things like fuel debts, helping to refer them to partner organizations, and our food hub. We then have a whole aspect of next generation work, so working with young people and families with children around how we can help them to support their young people to reach their potential. And then we have a whole thread of our work around a sustainable environment work. And this is, so we've crafted this to meet the need in our area. And it's, most of this is things that because there is no other organization doing these things. So there's a lot of things like the support activities where in the past people might have had, I think, one city council entire ward, whereas 5 years thereof that covered the council houses in our area. So where someone might have had a close relationship with their housing officer, they might have seen that person out and about, they might have been able to speak to them about something that was going on and get some help. That role doesn't exist anymore, or there's one person just spread too thin across all of it. So those people then don't have anyone to turn to if they have a question about their housing, or they have something. And so often what happens is they turn to us as somebody who's in the community, and we can then help them to try and find a solution to that. A lot of our environmental work has come from, again, from government cuts, whereas in the past there used to be rangers who were people who were based in the ward, and they would drive about and they would see problems that need fixing, and they might stop and cut an overhanging hedge or help somebody who was having difficulty keeping the path in front of their house clear. And that role has now gone. So again, we're back to helping to find community volunteers in order to help work on problem areas within the community. So that's an example of how our work has grown in order to meet some of these needs. And it's not just something that happens in Abbey, it's happened across the city. The community food hubs are something that opened in the pandemic as a response to the food need in the communities. And a lot of those food hubs have continued, and like us, have expanded their work and have become real community hubs where people can get much more than just some food to get them through the day. So this is one quote about the food hub, and this is from a lady who has 5 children and who was really struggling with lots of things. So she actually came to the food hub, you know, to get food, as you would, that's the immediate need. And obviously people come through the door and they are in an immediate need, we're able to help them. But what we were able to do through that relationship as well is we were able to get her access to other support organizations who were able to work out that she wasn't getting all of the support she was entitled to through benefits. They've been able to then help her to apply for additional support, and she's now been able to go on and get extra help in order to help make ends meet with her children. I think it is probably worth noting that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have just released a recent report which shows that universal credit is below the basic needs for an individual. So they've actually said they're calling for an increase in universal credit, because what they found is that it's below a living level. People can't live on benefits, and that's one of the things we find on a daily basis is people are accessing all of the benefits they are entitled to. They're living on a budget, they're doing all the things they could possibly do, but it is just, especially given the cost of living increase, it's just not possible to live in Cambridge on the level of benefits that universal credit currently is. So another quote, so these are 3 of our volunteers who work with us, and volunteering is completely and 100% at the heart of everything we do. And there's 2 answers, there's 2 reasons why. One is because we know volunteering is so important to so many people for so many reasons. We know there's huge personal, mental and physical health improvements that can happen for people who volunteer. And our volunteers tell us lots of things about, giving them an opportunity to have regular contact with people. It gives them a good rhythm to their day. It helps them to have a reason to get up in the morning. And these are all things that people have told us about volunteering. The other reality is there is absolutely no way that we could help the number of people and provide the level of support we do to people without volunteers. It would cost, we have more than 50 volunteers involved in our food hub activity, and there is no level of funding that would fund that level of staff to run a food hub. And that's the reality. Less than 10% of our funding is from government sources. So we spend a lot of time looking at other funding income, and there is no way we could do this work without the many volunteers that are involved. But volunteering is really, really important for individuals. And this quote from a caseworker talks about the importance of someone being supported by the community, but also being part of a community. And so, yes, people come to us for help, but then they also become part of something bigger than themselves. And that's so, so important for individuals. And it's really nice when other professionals see that we're making an impact on people's lives. So another story. So this is someone who does come to the food hub. I have changed the name. So this is someone who started coming into the food hub. They are late career, but not yet at a government retirement age. So they're unable to access their state pension. Has always worked until recently when they started having long-term ill health, which meant they were unable to do their very physical job. And so has been unable to work and has had to make that transition to benefits and all those sorts of things. Also, so speaking about austerity and funding, delays in NHS treatment mean that he's both in pain and has very limited mobility, which has, as you can imagine, affected his well-being. It affects whether or not he's able to access the food hub. So we often get phone calls saying, I'm having a bad day and I can't actually get out of the house to come get food. And it now looks that because the treatment has been so delayed, that it looks like it's unlikely that he will ever be able to have the surgery that could improve his pain and mobility. And therefore, which means it's likely he will never be able to return to work. And for these individuals, it is just a perfect storm of a whole different levels of cuts and austerity, which affects them. So it's not just the increase in the retirement age, meaning people have to wait longer to access their state pensions. It's also a reduction in how much people get for universal credit and the availability of things like personal independence payments. And then added to that are the budget cuts to the NHS, which means the NHS is under-resourced and people aren't able to access the healthcare they need. And we see this across all sorts of our beneficiaries across the area, whether it's an inability to be able to access a GP, whether it's a 6-month or a 12-month wait for mental health support, or whether it's a long wait for hospital treatment or surgeries. And I think what people often don't realize with statistics and these kinds of reports, and we hear in the news about increased waiting times and how that is, but when that's an individual who's waiting for a hip operation, that means they'll be able to walk without pain. That additional 3 months or 6 months of waiting time has a huge impact on an individual, and especially then when you start looking at older individuals and the need to remain active in order to age well and all those sorts of things, it adds a whole nother level to that. So another quote from somebody else who comes in and gets help from us said to us, just having someone to speak to and listen to has been more help than you can know. And for me, that really underpins the levels of loneliness that people are experiencing post-pandemic. The lack of connection that people have in their local communities. There's a lot of people who live in an area where they don't They don't know anybody, they don't have anyone nearby, and to have someone that they can trust is really, really important to them. And then 2 more quotes, which just look at some of the different things that we do. The food hub, and this one is a very recent quote that we just had, and it really jumped out. The second sentence, the person said, "Those days we can get to the food hub are better than average days." And that just, yeah, it was a lovely quote. And it really helped us to think about, the fact that we are helping people to meet their basic needs, but it's also a day that people can go and can be part of a community and see other people and chat and just be part of something real rather than what else is going on in their lives. And that was what the second quote was, that, people feel like they're contributing to something that's uplifting and it improves their confidence and well-being. And that's really, really nice to hear. And it's also good to know that the work we're doing is impacting people in that way. And so I'm going to stop and take questions. I think we're going to do that next, but it was what I really wanted to do from this slot was to take time to be able to share some of the individual stories of the impact austerity has on people. And one of the big questions we're now looking at as an organization and also with other partners across the city is starting to look at how we break the intergenerational cycles of poverty that we have in this ward, and how we can start to create real change economically for people within the ward. And that's the sort of the next steps for us. And we can take some questions.
Yes, thanks very much for that. That I think was a really useful look into, I think, probably a lot of things that a lot of people's research will touch on. Obviously, there's sort of the very real experience of more people who require services, but also the sort of broader costs within the NHS when the NHS can't really pick up with what it should be doing on a more regular basis, filtering then into the sort of daily lives of people when you have actually working against sort of what is hoped for by the government, that people as a result of cuts to services are now not actually able to go back to work and to be the kinds of people that the government is really looking for. So I think that there's a lot of really interesting narratives to come out of this, and I'm very grateful for this introduction. And since I see that there are a lot of people interested in asking questions, I will turn it over to them. I'm not sure if I saw exactly in which order everything went, so
I think it was Mia first.
That area, I'm pointing to Mia. So yes, Mia.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you for that, Nicky. Really interesting. And, knowing Cambridge, and I've done a little research myself on Cambridge, and, everything you said really resonates. I wanted to ask you, though, an issue about being so reliant on volunteers. It's both a wonderful thing and a vulnerable element of what you do as well. And when we went around the country doing some case studies, one of the things we heard was about volunteer burnout and how difficult it is to have that be most of your workforce, that it made of course with austerity all the individuals are being affected, but also, as you point out, the institutions also are being affected, right, with increased need and difficulty in delivery. So I wondered, as an organization, has this been an issue, and if so, to what have you done to try to cope with that? Yeah,
definitely, and it is. So it comes straight out of David Cameron's kind of big society policy, really, this idea that we'll get volunteers to do things, and it's something that it often gets discussed within the voluntary sector, and it's something that we often talk about at policy level, because often grant funders won't fund staff members. So they might fund a staff member for a few hours a week. They might fund a project coordinator if what they're doing is getting volunteers in, but they won't fund staff members to do the job fully, 100%. So it's partially a funding issue in that people won't fund projects. Our trustees made a very strategic decision in the pandemic to push for more funding. So my role came out of that. And a big part of my role has been developing our funding streams in order to have more staff. Pre-pandemic, Abbey people had half of an employee. And the rest was all done by the trustees, and it was nearly impossible to get trustees to stick around for more than a year, and and all those sorts of things. And realistically, as an organization, when you look at organizational risks, you have to have some sort of security of staff. We need to know that we've got the organizational knowledge of what's going on is being retained in the organization somewhere. And although there's lots of organizations that are able to do that with fully committed volunteers, you always are there's always that risk, as you say, with volunteers, that somebody's just going to ring up and say, sorry, something's come up today. And when they're a volunteer, you have to go, oh, no worries, we'll see you next week. Thanks for your help. That's what you do because they're volunteers and they're giving their time. But if you're looking to deliver a set of grant outcomes and all of those sorts of things, you need to be able to have more staff to back that up. And so we've been very clear in our strategy that that's what we want to do. And I've also had lots of conversations with grant funders around, trying to push back around funding for things. And there's also lots of stuff we're putting in around training for volunteers and trying to pinpoint volunteer roles so that people know what they're coming in to do, and that we're able to manage people's time and expectation better, and so that they aren't feeling like they're getting taken advantage of, or we're not too dependent on it specific individuals. But it continues to be a challenge, and it is a challenge for the whole of the voluntary sector, really.
Yeah, thank you.
That's right.
Ariane.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated the individual stories and that perspective that you offered to the start of this conference. It was really impactful and impressive. You've already sort of hinted at in your last answer to Niamh, which is really great, just talking about delivering on a set of grant outcomes. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, with maybe two individual questions that could be related. The first is that coming from the Canadian context, often grants, especially like public funds, are tied to certain metrics, from year to year. So I was curious if that was the case here in Cambridge or in the UK. And then I was also curious about whether you do use metrics and like what they are and how, how you use them. I'm just curious to learn a bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yes. So yeah, all grant funders are very keen to have specific outcomes, and there's definitely been a transition. During COVID, there was a kind of, well, just do what you need to and we'll be fine about it all kind of trend, which has reversed now. And different grant funders obviously have their own. There's some grant funders who have set objectives that you need to choose from what they want, and then other grant funders, you can choose your own. We have, as an organization, we've built a set of KPIs which incorporate all of the objectives from different grant funders, and then we track those across. I'd be really happy to have a coffee at some point if you want to kind of delve into those in more detail. One of the key ones we look at is self-reported health and well-being. So being involved in X project has improved my physical health, has improved my mental health. Which we can sort of track to the self-reported health questions in the census, the UK census. Health and well-being is an area which is, other than the self-reported census questions, there aren't really very many good benchmarking questions around health and well-being. And most of them are self-reported. So it's difficult to be able to have a clear data mark. And that's something I've had conversations with a number of different organizations with. And one of the things, for example, that I'm on an NHS board, and a lot of the public health stuff that we and other voluntary sector organizations do, within the NHS, they have a classification for a patient where they're managed by GP. So they have a long-term health condition, they're not at hospital level, but they're managed by GP. And they can be managed well by GP or not managed well by GP, but that they sit in that class of managed by GP. And one of the issues that a lot of voluntary sector organizations have is most of the people we're working with start and finish in that block because they have a long-term health condition that they're always going to have. It might be that when they started coming to us, they, for example, were struggling with their mental health, but managed by GP. And they're now engaging with us. They're volunteering regularly. They've got a good timeline in their life. They still have a long-term mental health condition. They're doing much better, but they're still managed by GP. So if you look at the statistics, nothing has changed. And so that's something that we've been trying to delve into a lot. And obviously all of you as researchers, if anybody's got any ideas on metrics that you're aware of, because it's something that health and well-being is a really tricky one to try to manage from a quantitative point of view. So yeah, we mostly use self-reported, and then we look at other things like, you know, we ask people, has the food hub, you know, improved your nutrition? Has it improved your confidence around cooking? You know, things like that around specific projects. But those self-reported health and well-being and loneliness indicators are probably the key ones that we use across the organization.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Would love to have a coffee, even if it's a Zoom one. That would be really good. And I just wanted to say, I hope it's okay, Niamh, but I was just going to invite Mark Sabian, because he's just published a book on metrics and subjective well-being. I just saw that he was in the Zoom room, but also no pressure, Mark. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I don't really know what you want me to say though, but I'm giving a talk on it tomorrow. It's not a book on metrics, just a couple of papers. Yeah. But we have been working with some charities that do either help people in poverty or work on complex disadvantage around helping them to develop metrics, both for their own use and then to report to funders and that sort of thing. Yeah.
I'll make sure I catch that later then. Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any other questions just to round out the session? Don't see any in the chat. I'd like to thank you, obviously, a lot, Nicky, for this, because as I said, I think it probably really touches on a lot of aspects that some people will work on in very different and sometimes siloed ways, as is sort of the nature of research. I think it really highlights the way that this big society policy program, which obviously, as we know, never really like amounted to a huge self-sustained policy program, has still really permeated, I think, the way that welfare works and is administered in this country. I think there's definitely an element in which the support for people will come from community organizations or things like Citizens Advice Bureau or something like that. And what it so often revolves around is somebody asking for help with things like benefits, as you absolutely mentioned, but in a lot of cases asking for help about how to manage benefits overpayment or because they're not receiving what they could be, as you also mentioned. So I think there's something really interesting in the way that this work just really highlights, I suppose, how far these policy implications can go, because of course we're seeing the unfolding of a lot of new ideas that don't necessarily quite have the infrastructure to back them up yet in leveling up. So I think community organizations will probably be very useful in that regard. But yes, I see, Mark, you have your hand up now.
I did just a quick follow-up on that question, maybe building on something Mia said earlier. I'd be interested, Nicky, in your perspective on that big society stuff. So it seems to me like, given that sort of neoliberalism is like 40 years old now, and most of the funding for community infrastructure has been stripped out, and most of the I guess social infrastructure around that sort of thing that we had in, say, the 70s with, I think in particular, church groups and people tithing to church groups, and then also the different structure of the household where women were much more likely to be stay at home, and then they would spend a lot more time doing volunteer stuff. So given that, I think both the government funding for social infrastructure has died and the community community structures that supported it has died. If big society were to be realistic today, it seems to me like you would need to have a substantial tranche of government funding to kind of replace tithing or replace that sort of stuff. What's been do you have any insights or experiences on that front?
Yeah, definitely. And and this is a sort of slightly small p political statement, it's a policy statement, I guess, is that I don't think community groups should be required to provide the social net that government should provide. So, and that obviously is a personal statement, but but what we're finding, because of the kind of big society question, and because all of that's been cut out, so now community groups are providing all the youth workers, they're providing family support, they're providing early help, they're providing, all these things that really should be government responsibilities, in my opinion. And so, there is definitely a role for the community to play in looking after each other and helping each other out, and looking after the elderly neighbor who might need something from the shop, or those sorts of things that that, yes, we should be doing those things because we're people who live in community and we should look after each other. But is it the local neighborhood group's responsibility to help somebody with a complicated energy debt case? Is it the community organization's responsibility to help somebody who's going through a really complicated legal case to get custody of their children and there's no legal aid? So it's kind of, yes, there's definitely a place for big society, for volunteering, for people. I strongly feel that everybody should be giving in some way in their local community. But so I guess that's one thing. And the other thing is, yes, we definitely would need more funding in order to make that happen, because I've been working in community campaigning and community work for 15 years, and community does not happen on its own. It needs something to spur it. You either need funded people, organizations with funding making things happen. You need individuals who are independently wealthy, who can afford to do it for free, or you need something really horrible to unite the community, to campaign together, come together, and without one of those three things, community doesn't happen on its own.
Thanks, that's really helpful.
I think that's probably a very convenient place to wrap this panel up. Thank you very much for this session, for the first set of questions and discussions. I think that's been a really good way to start the conference. So thank you, Nicky. Thank you for your time. And thank you, everybody else.
Thank you, Nicky.
Yeah, thank you.